Welcome back to Chinese 270, China and the West. Where had we left off last week? Well, we had of course started to talk about Sino-Western trade in the 17th and 18th century. And we had discussed how, beginning in the mid-18th century, the Kangxi Emperor had granted licenses to a group of Canton merchants to conduct trade with foreign merchants. And for the next 100 years, these so-called Hong merchants, or Ko-Hongs, and foreign traders had amassed immense wealth from this trade that was really beneficial to both sides. And of course we had looked at some of those images that had come out of that trade, right? A lot of them trade paintings, or also just paintings by Westerners. And of course you had all picked a few of those items and discussed them. Now I want to recommend a set of books to you if you're interested in this period, if you're interested in the trade relationship and everything else that happens around that, including the paintings. Want to recommend these books by an Indian author called Amitav Ghosh, and it's a trilogy called the Ibis Trilogy. The first part is named The Sea of Poppies, second one is Flood of Fire, and the last one is River of Smoke. And it covers precisely this period from many different perspectives. So you get a Chinese perspective, a British perspective, an Indian perspective, and it's absolutely fabulous. So if you still need a good read for Thanksgiving, how about you put that on your list? Now for almost 100 years, this Ko-Hong system was acceptable to both Chinese and Europeans because it was mutually beneficial. However, the demand for Chinese products, especially for tea, continually increased, leaving European nations, and especially Britain, with a huge trade deficit and a net outflow of silver. Silver was the currency in China at the time, and those Westerners had to pay for these products with silver. Now, in the meantime, trade patterns became increasingly complex and interconnected, especially in the wake of European imperialism, the development of global capitalism. We talked a little bit about that in past weeks. Examples of this: the British started to grow sugar in the Caribbeans, some of their newest colonies, cotton and tobacco in the Americas. This is then shipped back to Britain for processing and export to all over the world. Now at the same time, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, again, I'm sure you've heard about that, you've studied about the Industrial Revolution, Britain sought new markets for their manufactured goods, fabrics that are manufactured in factories. We have increasingly things made of steel, steam engines, technology, etc. And Britain tried to sell these things also to China. And they also wanted to establish with China Western-style diplomatic relations, which is something else that we're seeing as the world in the 18th century becomes more and more globalized. We think of this as a 20th century or 21st century phenomena. Well, it wasn't. In the meantime, the British East India Company, we heard a lot about that company last week, greedy for revenue to satisfy shareholders back in Britain, took over parts of Bengal in the mid-18th century, right here. And what that means is that the company had over time acquired more and more land and had built up an army, mostly consisting of mercenaries, and found itself in a position where it actually could challenge local political and military leaders and started to conquer land. And it's from here then, it's from these bases here in Bengal that British traders then started to intensively trade with China. Now, one thing that is really important to remember is that the colonization of India was essentially begun by the East India Company. So it was really this private company that of course had very close ties to the British government, but ultimately it was a private company and not the British state. It was only much later that Britain, after a series of unrests, essentially took over the possessions of the East India Company in India, and India became part of the British Empire. But it was really the East India Company that started it. At some point, the East India Company had an army numbering 200,000 men. And most of them were not English. A lot of them, were Indian mercenaries. In the meantime, so we have a lot of in the meantime this week, Britain, as I said, tried to establish closer official relations with China. At the time, of course, still the Qing dynasty. And in 1793, King George III dispatches Lord Macartney to the court of China, to Qianlong's court. And under Qianlong, China was arguably at its peak. It had the world's largest economy and its greatest size ever. I think I showed you a map a couple of weeks ago. Now, Qianlong received Lord Macartney in a very polite fashion, essentially gave him the state honors, and Lord Macartney paid tribute. He brought lots of gifts, but he also brought requests. So he requested that trading restrictions between Britain and China be relaxed, that British traders may reside and store their goods on an island near the mouth of the Yangtze, which ultimately would be Zhoushan, and that a permanent British embassy be established in Beijing. Qianlong presented Macartney with a letter that he had written to George III, and we will read that letter. It's not a very long letter. At least what I'm posting, an excerpt from the letter which we're reading, is not very long. It's very, very, very interesting. In a nutshell, what he's doing in the letter, he's refusing all those requests, but maybe sensing a new military threat, he simultaneously ordered to strengthen China's coastal fortification. So the Chinese sort of sense that there is maybe a new threat on the horizon. Here is an image of Qianlong receiving Lord Macartney. This painting is called The Approach of the Emperor of China to his tent in Tartary to receive the British ambassador, painted in 1793. And what is interesting is that the British public took a huge interest in this mission. And the mission itself was very well documented. And it produced lots of images and etchings and paintings and writings. And these were published in weekly papers back in London. And it also produced a lot of knowledge about China, new knowledge about China. Remember, up until then, it was mostly missionaries, it was mostly the Jesuits who provided that knowledge. And here's a caricature of that meeting that appeared again in a British paper. You can take a look, see what you think of that. And as you read that reply by Qianlong to King George III, I want you to think about a few things. What were the English demands, and what arguments does Qianlong make in refusing those demands? How did the Chinese perceive of the British? And did the Chinese think all states were equal in international relations? What did the Chinese emperor think China had to offer England? What did he feel England had to offer China? How do you think English politicians and merchants, or just, the British public, reacted to this letter? So please bear this in mind, because as you will see, all of this will be part of our forum assignment for this week, which is kind of exciting, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, tea continued to be the most important Chinese export, and it was particularly prized in England, where people really essentially had gotten hooked on tea, especially if it was served together with cheap sugar from the Caribbean. It sort of became an energy drink that powered the Industrial Revolution. It was especially the working classes that drank a lot of tea for the caffeine and sugar for the energy. The British East India Company purchased 13,500 tons of tea in 1810. And taxing that tea became a major source of revenue for the British government, right? So the tea came back to England, and because so many people drank it and drank so much of it, they could tax it, right? It's always good to tax commodities that people really rely on, right? Like gas or tobacco in an earlier age. And of course, we'll be talking about that a little bit next week. That taxation of tea, of course, also had huge consequences in other parts of the world, like America. So you see, it's all connected. It's all connected. It's interesting, the tea came to Canton over the months of the trading season. And here on the right, you have a lovely painting that sort of encapsulates all the different processes, right? From planting the tea and then transporting it down to the river where it's repackaged and then ultimately put on ships and then brought to Canton, and then it will ultimately end up on a clipper ship that would bring it to the markets in Europe, to London, right? So merchants would negotiate the best price and try to ship the tea home as quickly as possible, because freshness meant the highest profits. The first ship to reach London with the new crop, of course, could fetch the highest prices. Meanwhile, the volume of British imports from China continued to grow. The British desperately sought greater access to Chinese markets, right? As the China trade was draining silver out of England. I mentioned that. A huge trade deficit. And that's never good if you're engaged in trade, right? You kind of want to balance out your balance sheet, of your trade balance sheet. And of course, we're seeing that right now happening, right? That trade balance that America has with China. And again, it's leading to conflict. Now, in addition, the East India Company had long wanted a permanent base in the Pearl River Delta. Do you remember that? The Pearl River Delta, Macau on the one side where the Portuguese sat, and Hong Kong to be on the other side, right? From where you essentially could enter the southern part of China. Now, the East India Company searched for a counterpart commodity to trade for tea and porcelain. That was another big commodity that the Chinese exported. And they eventually settled on opium, a highly addictive drug, the consumption of which had a long history in China, since at least the 16th century, after tobacco had been introduced. But it was illegal during the Qing dynasty, as it was in England and most other places, because it was so highly addictive, except as a medicinal remedy for certain ailments. Now, the East India Company, and you see EIC is just the acronym for East India Company, encouraged tenant farmers in Bengal, right, in northern India, to reserve a certain percentage of their land for opium cultivation, which they then had to sell at a fixed price to the East India Company, right? So the East India Company owns land in Bengal. They rent that land out to Indian or Bengali farmers, and they tell them, if you rent our land, you have to grow a certain percent of opium on that land. And you can only sell it to us. We have the sole monopoly in opium, right? So you have to sell it to us at a fixed price. And then what did the East India Company do? They then sold that opium to British and American and other countries' merchants, whoever wanted to purchase it. And those merchants then took the opium and shipped it to China and sold it there illegally. So you see that the East India Company was not actually involved in the actual trade of opium in China, kept its hands clean of that. But of course, the East India Company, and by extension its shareholders back in London, were the main beneficiaries, because the East India Company had the monopoly. They could dictate the prices. They sold very little for that opium to those Bengali farmers. Of course, they sold it to British merchants at much higher prices, and they then would sell it for even higher prices to Chinese middlemen, Chinese smugglers in China. These opium ships would moor off Linton Island, where they then were met by Chinese smugglers. And you might remember that map, right? We have Canton here up the Pearl River, and then we have Whampoa, right, where Western ships usually would moor for the legitimate trade, but down here we have Linton Island, and this is where the opium ships would moor, and then they would be met by Chinese smugglers. And again, to remind you, right, we have Macau here and we have Hong Kong here on the other side of the delta. Now by 1835, that trade deficit had been reversed, and $18 million of silver were being drained out of the Chinese economy. So now there is a net loss for the Chinese, and at the same time, numbers of addictions, especially, guess what, among the elites, the people who could afford this drug, government officials, rose dramatically. Now let's speak for 1 second about one of the great villains in world history, William Jardine, and his partner James Matheson owned a company which still exists to this day, Jardine Matheson. That was the larger importer of opium into China. Jardine once wrote to a missionary boarding his ship. Remember, missionaries like to travel with, right, Spanish, the Portuguese, later British traders, right? They would hitch rides on these ships. Of course, they had to pay for them. And Jardine Matheson said, "We have no hesitation in stating to you openly that our principal reliance is on opium, which by many is considered an immoral traffic. Yet such traffic is so absolutely necessary to give any vessel a reasonable chance of defraying her expenses that we trust you will have no objection." Now guess what? Officials at the Qing court had objections. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Actually, there were some officials at the Qing court who advocated legalizing and then taxing opium. And it's kind of interesting because obviously we see very similar debates today about drugs. There are certain countries like the Netherlands that have started to legalize certain drugs because they think, well, that's the only way to stop these huge sums of profits being made by this trade, right? So the Chinese, there were some Chinese politicians who had a similar idea. But ultimately, the policy approach was to ban it. And here, one of the heroes of world history comes onto the stage, Lin Zexu. So important, he made it onto a stamp. Not just one, probably many stamps. In 1839, Lin Zexu becomes the imperial commissioner in Canton, right? The big trading city where it all happens. In 1839, he writes a famous letter to the sovereign of England. And this is another piece that we will read this week. The letter never reached Queen Victoria, who was the sovereign at the time, but it was eventually published by various newspapers and had a profound impact on public opinion, and we're going to look at a snippet in a minute. Now, Lin attempted to get foreign companies to forfeit their opium stores in exchange for tea. But this failed too, right? So he tried to talk them out of it, played nice cop for a while. But then, eventually, Lin demanded that all supplies of opium be surrendered to the Chinese authorities before blockading the Pearl River Channel and taking British traders hostage. Let me show you this map again. So basically, right, the mouth of the Pearl River was blockaded, and any British ship that was still here, that was still moored in the delta, was taken hostage. Now the British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, someone else who has a pretty tarnished reputation, when it comes to world history, guaranteed British traders compensation for their losses, which was later used as an important casus belli, cause for war, for the subsequent British declaration of war. He basically promised those British traders, somebody is going to pay for your losses. You wait until we start a war with China, and we'll find somebody to pay for your losses. This is essentially what he said. Chinese officials seized $6 million worth of opium. In today's money, that's $145 million, and destroyed it publicly. There are images of that. This is a Chinese image. There are movies about that if you want to see it. But of course, that money, those $145 million in today's currency, right? That was somebody's losses. And whose losses was that? Well, it was mostly people who owned shares in these various trading companies, right? People who owned shares in these ships. So obviously, some people weren't happy about this. And I promised you we would read a little snippet from Lin Zexu's letter. So I posted the whole letter on iLearn. You have to read it. Again, it's part of this week's assignment. But let's just have a quick peek at this together. So Lin Zexu wrote, "We find that your country is 60 or 70,000 li from China, yet there are barbarian ships that strive to come here for trade for the purpose of making great profit." And note that I highlighted the word barbarian here in Chinese. We of course already encountered the term man or manzi, right? Lin Zexu actually uses yi to refer to the British. And then of course we talked about the idea of profit as something that was rather despicable in the Confucian ideology. So here he uses the word li, profit. The wealth of China is used to profit the barbarians. That is to say, the great profit made by barbarians, did I say Bavarians? Sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Barbarians is all taken from the rightful share of China. By what right do they then in return use the poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? Even though the barbarians may not necessarily intend to do us harm, yet in coveting profit to an extreme, they have no regard for injuring others. Let us ask, where is your conscience? I have heard that the smoking of opium is very strictly forbidden by your country. That is because the harm caused by opium is clearly understood. Since it is not permitted to do harm to your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to the harm of other countries. How much less to China? All of that China export to foreign countries. There is not a single thing which is not beneficial to people. They are of benefit when eaten, or of benefit when used, or of benefit when resold. All are beneficial. Is there a single article from China which has done any harm to foreign countries? Take tea and rhubarb, for example. The foreign countries cannot get along for a single day without them. Now, what is Commissioner Lin's views of Westerners and the West in general? How does the West compare to China? What are his arguments against the trade in opium? Do you find his arguments convincing? Then, right, in 1839 and today? And how do his views compare to those of Emperor Qianlong, as expressed in his letter? And besides stopping the opium trade, what other changes in the Chinese-Western relationship would Lin Zexu have welcomed? And as an additional question I want you to ponder about, what is he talking about when he's talking about rhubarb? Alright, I'll leave it here for now, but I will see you shortly in the second course stream.